The morning a woman tried to bill me $52,000 for land my family had owned since 1919, I learned something strange about quiet people. Most folks assume quiet means weak. Karen Miller made that mistake, and it cost her everything. She showed up at my fence line on a bright Texas morning. Pink tracksuit, clipboard tucked under one arm, two board members standing behind her like cheap security guards. My 4-strand barbed wire fence ran between us, the same fence my grandfather helped string across this land nearly a century ago. She didn't even say hello. She shoved a paper through the wire. "Your grandfather's handshake is worthless here, Colonel," she said, her voice dripping with suburban authority. "According to the Whispering Pines Estate's bylaws, you're in violation." I unfolded the paper slowly. At the bottom of the page sat the number, $52,840.17. For a second, I thought it had to be a joke. But Karen wasn't laughing. "You owe 5 years of HOA dues," she continued, "plus compliance penalties for unapproved structures, commercial vehicles, and poor landscape maintenance." She gestured across my property like she was inspecting a junkyard. My barn, my truck, my hayfield, the land my great-grandfather bought after returning from the First World War. Now, apparently, it belonged to her homeowners association. I kept my voice calm. "You're mistaken." Karen let out a short, sharp laugh. "Oh no, Colonel. The board voted last quarter to annex the adjacent parcel for green space management." She tapped the clipboard proudly. "That parcel is you." Behind her, Whispering Pines Estates stretched across what used to be farmland. Rows of identical beige houses, perfect lawns, mailboxes standing like soldiers in formation. A plastic neighborhood built on land that once fed half this county. And now they wanted mine. Karen told me I had 1 week to pay or the HOA would place a lien on my property. Then she turned, marched back toward the subdivision, and left me standing at the fence with a piece of paper that might as well have been a declaration of war. For a long time, I just stood there looking across the fields. In the Army Corps of Engineers, I spent 30 years building bridges in places where men carried rifles instead of clipboards. But somehow this moment felt just as hostile. Because war isn't always loud. Sometimes it arrives with polite paperwork. That evening, I walked the entire perimeter of my land. 200 acres. Every fence post, every tree line, every dip in the soil carried memories. My grandfather cutting hay with a rusted tractor. My father teaching me how to mend barbed wire. Summers where the air smelled like fresh grass and diesel fuel. This land wasn't an undeveloped parcel. It was history. When I got back to the house, I laid 2 documents on the kitchen table. Karen's HOA notice and my original deed from 1919. The difference between them said everything. Her paper was flimsy, full of threats and legal jargon. Mine was thick parchment stamped with the seal of the state of Texas. 200 acres. Clearly surveyed. Clearly mine. But I didn't call Karen. I didn't argue. Because one lesson from the Army had stuck with me all these years. The man who loses his temper loses the fight. So instead I call my daughter Sarah. She's a paralegal in Austin and one of the smartest people I know. I read her the notice word for word. When I finished, there was silence on the phone. Then Sarah started laughing. "Dad, that's not how HOAs work." "What do you mean?" "They can't annex your land," she said. "An HOA is a contract between homeowners inside a subdivision. They can't just vote to absorb someone else's property." She paused while typing. "Actually, if they filed paperwork claiming that this might be fraud." Fraud. That word changed everything. The next morning, I drove into town to the county courthouse, a heavy limestone building that smelled like dust and old paper. Behind the records counter sat a woman named Brenda with silver hair piled into a towering beehive. She'd clearly spent decades guarding those files. When I told her what I needed, she gave me a knowing look. Whispering Pines? Apparently, the place already had a reputation. Brenda pulled up the original subdivision map from 2005. My property sat right beside it, clearly labeled. Adjacent. Not included. "See that line?" she said, tapping the screen. "That's the boundary. Anything beyond that isn't part of the HOA." But then she found another document filed 6 months earlier. an amendment to the map. And when it opened, we both leaned closer. Someone had redrawn the boundary line. My 200 acres were suddenly labeled. Whispering Pines Section D, Future Greenbelt. But the details were sloppy. The surveyor's signature was a rubber stamp. And the notary's seal. Brenda squinted. "Well, I'll be," she muttered. "That's Karen Miller's stamp." "You mean she notarized her own document?" Brenda leaned back slowly. "That's illegal." Right then the whole thing became clear. Karen hadn't misunderstood the law. She had tried to steal land with a forged map, and she had filed it with the county. From that moment on, the fight changed. I stopped arguing. I started documenting. Every letter the HOA sent went into a 3-ring binder. Every envelope photographed. Every violation logged. Karen kept sending fines. My barn violated architectural guidelines. My hayfield violated landscaping standards. My mailbox wasn't the correct color. At one point, she even fined me for the appearance of agricultural equipment, which meant my tractor. Each letter went into the binder. And with every new page, the evidence grew heavier. But something unexpected happened along the way. One afternoon, I met a young couple from the subdivision named David and Emily. They were repainting their front door. Apparently, they had received a $1,000 fine because the trim was Arctic white instead of whisper white. When I showed them my binder, Emily nearly dropped the paintbrush. "That's insane," she said. Word spread. Soon other residents contacted me. Garden gnome violations. Basketball hoop fines. Mailbox citations. Karen wasn't just harassing me. She was squeezing the entire neighborhood. Then we discovered the real twist. The HOA's management company, Pristine Properties, handled all maintenance, landscaping, and compliance enforcement. And guess who owned it? Karen's brother-in-law. Every HOA dollar flowed through that company. The fines, the fees, the contracts. The entire system was a family money machine. When my lawyer saw the evidence, he leaned back in his chair and smiled. "Colonel," he said, "you didn't just catch a bully. You caught a criminal enterprise. Instead of quietly filing a lawsuit, we chose something different. A public county commissioners meeting." Karen thought it was just another boring zoning discussion. But when the projector turned on, the room saw everything. The forged map, the illegal notarization, the harassment letters, and finally the financial chart showing HOA money flowing straight into Karen's family business. The room exploded. Neighbors shouting. Commissioners demanding answers. Karen sitting frozen in her chair as her entire empire collapsed in 10 minutes. The aftermath was swift. The county erased the fraudulent map. The state opened a fraud investigation. The IRS revoked the HOA's tax-exempt status. Karen and her brother-in-law pleaded guilty to felony fraud. They were ordered to pay restitution and banned from ever serving on a nonprofit board again. The HOA went bankrupt. A new association formed with simple rules. Basketball hoops returned. Garden gnomes multiplied. And the neighborhood finally started acting like a community instead of a dictatorship. About a year later, my daughter and I sat on the porch watching the sun sink behind the fields. "You know," Sarah said, "most people would have just paid the fine." Maybe she was right. But as I looked across the land my family had cared for over 4 generations, I realized something important. Some fights aren't about money. They're about lines. Lines on a map. Lines in history. Lines in a man's life that define who he is and what he stands for. Karen thought she was collecting dues. I was defending 100 years of legacy. And sometimes when someone crosses the wrong line, the quiet man at the fence becomes the most dangerous opponent they'll ever meet. Now I'm curious about something. If you were in my place, if someone tried to take your land with paperwork and intimidation, would you fight back the way I did? Or would you just pay the fine and move on? Because stories like this happen more often than people think. Tell me what you would do. And if you've ever had your own HOA nightmare, I'd love to hear that story too.